Okay, so let's go ahead and get ourselves started for this morning. Um, Good morning, welcome. It is Wednesday, the 13th day of February in 2020. This is the weekly Zoom class meeting for Political Science 1, class number 30013. My name is Paul Savoy, and I'm really happy to have you join me this morning. Always appreciate it when you show up. And this morning, several things that we want to go ahead and accomplish. First thing, in just a couple of minutes, I'll go ahead, give you a few announcements, reminders, some important things to be thinking about as we get into the last few weeks of the semester. After that, I will then take any questions that you have dealing with the topic that we went over in some detail during last week's weekly class Zoom meeting. That is talking a little bit about the presidency. Now, hopefully, since last week, you've had a chance to delve into the presidency notes that I posted for you on Canvas into more detail. Hopefully, you've had a chance to also get into the assigned reading for the presidency, as well as the crash course videos that I assigned for you to look at as well. Because remember, your next discussion forum post assignment does deal with the presidency, and it is due tonight at 11:59 p.m. Now, remember that due date does not include the automatic 3-day grace period. So you do have an additional 72 hours after tonight at 11:59 p.m. to submit your discussion forum post to be via Canvas. And I will not deduct any points for lateness as long as you get the assignment submitted during that 3-day grace period. So I'll deal with any questions that you have about the presidency or about the discussion forum post assignment dealing with the presidency. And then finally, we'll spend the rest of our time together this morning talking a little bit about the stuff you're going to be learning about next week between this Wednesday and next Wednesday. And that is talking a bit about the third of the three national government branches that the framers created in our current U.S. Constitution, this time in Article 3. And that is to talk a little bit about the judicial branch, essentially the federal court system. So what I will do is give you a couple of highlights, kind of talk a little bit about some of the most important concepts that I included in the class notes on the judicial branch, which I posted for you up on our Canvas homepage for this class yesterday afternoon. So I'll go over those points, deal with any questions that you have, that sort of thing. So that pretty much is the agenda for today. So why don't we go ahead and get straight into this? And let me start by just giving you a few announcements and reminders because, believe it or not, we have only a few weeks left in the spring semester. It feels like, especially since the whole COVID-19 crisis and having to move the class completely online and all of that. In some ways, it feels like the spring semester has been going on for about 2 years, something like that, right? But in other ways, it also feels like it's moving really fast and we're going to be done. Remember, this semester ends as of Wednesday, June 3rd. So we only have a few weeks left. And because we only have a few weeks left, I wanted to remind you about a few things. And the main thing that I wanted to remind you, just in case you haven't thought about it in a while, or in case you haven't taken a look at the schedule for the class in a while, and that is that our Students' Choice Project will be due exactly 2 weeks from today. So that is Wednesday, May 27th. So if it's been a while since you've worked on your Students' Choice Project, you probably want to get back to that. Start completing it sooner rather than later. You don't want to wait till the last minute to get this thing done. And especially if you haven't yet started your work on the Students' Choice Project, you want to get started with it again sooner rather than later. The assignment guidelines, all of the options for the Students' Choice Project are listed for you simply by going to our class Canvas homepage, clicking on the assignments link in the left-hand main menu. And then once you get to the assignments page, simply scroll down to where it says Students' Choice Project, click on that link, and all the information is there. Remember, Once we moved the class fully online, once it was determined that we were going to be spending all of spring semester doing this online, we wouldn't be going back to face-to-face meetings. I did go ahead and amend the Student's Choice Project. I reduced, for one thing, the minimum page requirement for the Student's Choice Project, and I also added a couple of additional topic options for you to choose from. So again, the project is due in 2 weeks from tonight. Again, 11:59 p.m. on the 27th of May, plus the 3-day grace period, because that counts on the Student's Choice Project too. It counts on all of our assignments. And if you have questions, comments, problems, complaints, etc., about the Student's Choice Project, please, over the next couple of weeks, please do feel free to send me an email, send me a Canvas message, or to drop by and chat with me one-on-one during my twice weekly virtual student hours here on Zoom. And remember, those virtual student hours take place every Monday and Wednesday afternoon. So I'll be doing them again this afternoon between 1:30 and 2:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And again, the virtual student hours are not like our weekly Zoom meetings for this class. I'm not lecturing or doing anything like that. I am simply making myself available to chat with you one-on-one via Zoom about anything that you need to talk to me about, whether it has something specifically to do with this class or has absolutely nothing to do with this class. Maybe you just need to spend a few minutes and vent to a friendly face. I am here for you for whatever you need. So if you want to visit me during my virtual student hours, simply go to our class Canvas homepage, scroll down past the picture into the section labeled Basic Course Information, and you will see both the Zoom link for those twice weekly virtual student hours, as well as the password that you will need to access those virtual student hours as well. And if you need to talk to me, but those virtual student hours don't work in your schedule, maybe you have another class that's meeting at that time, maybe your work schedule has you unavailable at that time, whatever it is. If you want to set up a one-on-one Zoom appointment with me, please let me know. Just send me a Canvas message or an email. Give me some idea of when you might be available, days and times that you might be available for that one-on-one Zoom conversation. And I will pick one that works, send you a custom Zoom link for that meeting, and we can go from there. So that's about it. The other announcement, obviously, I mentioned it a few minutes ago, is that your next discussion forum post assignment dealing with the presidency is due tonight at 11:59 p.m. Again, not counting the 3-day grace period. So any questions before we do anything else, before we move on and talk about any questions that you might have about the presidency, any general questions about anything having to do with this class before we go ahead and move on? And throughout the meeting today, as always, you can either ask a question or make a comment by unmuting your mic and speaking up, or if you'd rather, you can go ahead and put a question or comment in the group chat, and I can respond to it that way as well. So any general questions or comments before we go ahead and move on with the show for this morning? Anybody?
No, I don't have any questions.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate that. So seeing nothing, why don't we go ahead and move on? Because again, last week, I spent a good amount of time giving you a preview, kind of giving you some of the highlights from the class notes that I had given you on Canvas, dealing with the subject that you have been learning about this week since last Wednesday, that of course being the presidency. And if you recall from last time, there were two major points that I emphasized from the presidency notes on Canvas. The first major point was the fact that the framers, when they sat down to create the U.S. Constitution back in 1787, were relatively unconcerned about the presidency. The framers did not feel that the presidency, for a couple of reasons that we talked about last week, they didn't feel like the presidency had all that much potential to become overly powerful or to become abusive of that authority. So in other words, the framers didn't fear the potential power and abuse of power by the president in the way that they did Congress. Remember, the framers were petrified about the possibility of Congress becoming too powerful, spinning out of control, and abusing people's natural rights. They did not have that fear with the presidency. And so last week, I emphasized the fact that, that's a very different attitude that the framers had about the presidency compared with how most Americans perceive the presidency today. Remember how we said that most Americans today, and this has been a trend that we've seen over the past like 50 years or so, so it hasn't just been since the Donald Trump presidency or anything like that. But over the past several decades, we've gotten to a point where most Americans today believe that hands down, by far, the president is the most powerful and potentially the most dangerous of the three national government branches. That if any part of the national government is going to potentially abuse its power and threaten our freedoms and threaten American democracy and all that stuff, it's the president. So we spent a few minutes in going over the presidency notes last week, trying to figure out how we got from there to here. How do we get from the framers not fearing abuse of power by the president to where we are today, where most Americans do fear abuse of power by the president? And remember what we said, just as was the case with Congress that we discussed the week previously, how we got from there to here is the framers' fault. It is the framers' fault that today most of us perceive the president as being potentially too powerful and abusive of that power. Why? Well, because the framers, since they were not concerned about the presidency, since they did not believe that presidents would become overly powerful and abusive of their authority, the framers did not see the need to sweat the details when they were creating the structure and function and powers and process of the presidency in Article 2 of the Constitution. They didn't try to box the presidency in, or the president in the way that they box Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. That's why, as we said last week, Article 2, dealing with the presidency, is significantly less detailed and a lot more vague than Article 1. The framers just really didn't feel the need to carefully specify what presidents could and could not do. And that decision, that very conscious decision on the part of the framers, is why most of us fear abuse of power by the presidency today, because the framers didn't sweat the details. And as we talked about last week and is talked about in your presidency notes, the fact that the framers didn't sweat the details with the powers of the presidency in Article 2 has allowed modern presidents, meaning presidents since and including Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR in the 1930s, to essentially invent new powers for themselves and dramatically increase their level of power and authority over time. So that from the 30s to the present day, every president that we've had in one way or another has sought to take advantage of the lack of detail in Article 2 to really increase the power they have available. And that's why so many of us fear the presidency today. Okay. So does that still making sense? Any leftover questions or comments about that element of the presidency that we emphasized last time? Questions or comments? You can unmute and speak or put something in the group chat. We good with this? Yeah.
Yeah. I think.
Okay. Super. All right. So remember, the other main point that I emphasized last time with regard to the presidency notes on Canvas was the fact that, at this point in our history, in the year 2020, we have had 45 different presidents under our current U.S. Constitution, starting with George Washington and going all the way up to our current president, number 45 himself, Donald J. Trump, right? And remember what we said last week, and remember what the notes say about this, specifically in section 2 of the presidency notes. We emphasize the fact that, lots of historians and political scientists and journalists and other folks who are interested in the presidency over time have developed all these lists, right? Kind of like something you would see from BuzzFeed, the top 10 presidents in the history of the United States, or the 10 best presidents and the 10 worst presidents in the history of the United States. And what all of those lists that we see, and there are lots of them out there, the question that arises from them is, why is it that some presidents in US history have been so much more successful, so much more effective in doing their job as president than others? So we talked last week about the fact that we've had several really excellent presidents, right? Folks like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, FDR, people like that. We've also had a lot of presidents, probably the majority of presidents, that most people would say, oh, well, they were fine. They weren't great. They weren't horrible. They were all right. They did okay, right? And we also have some presidents, though this gets a bit more controversial, who are seen as being really rather bad, really rather ineffective, not doing a good job in trying to solve problems in the country during their presidency. Certainly, one relatively recent and controversial example of that would be Richard Nixon in the late 60s and early 70s. And so all of this leads to this question: why is it that some presidents in our history have been so much more effective at doing their jobs as president than others? And remember what I told you last week. I said, there are lots of different factors, lots of different variables that can help to decide why one president is going to be a lot more successful and a lot more effective than others. So there's no one single defining answer to this question. However, based on all of the research that's been done on this stuff over time, the one really consistent thread that we see in the research is that a very significant factor as to why some presidents are more successful and effective than others is the ability of our most successful presidents to be able to build and maintain high levels of public support. So again, as we said last week, publicly popular presidents seem to get more done. They seem to be more successful. And we talked about why that was last week. And I talk about it again in section 2 of the presidency notes. What I emphasized was the fact that if a president is going to do a very effective job during their time in office, if a president is going to be able to very successfully kind of impose their agenda on the country and create new laws and rules and programs and all these things to help solve problems that we're facing in the country at the time, the president can't do it alone, right? And as we've said previously, modern presidents, contemporary presidents in particular, really are a lot more powerful than their predecessors. They have a lot more ability to do things on their own. But even then, even now, a president is not going to be successful. A president is not going to be able to get a lot of things done unless they have the consistent support of the US Congress. Why? Well, because it is the job of Congress to make national government laws. It's not the president's job. The president's not supposed to be able to make laws, though presidents can do so in certain circumstances, right? Using that invented power that we talked about in the presidency notes called the executive order. But for the most part, if presidents need new laws, new programs, new rules, new regulations to advance their agenda for the country, they can't just snap their fingers and they magically appear. They need to rely on Congress to create and pass those laws, those rules, those regulations, to create those new government programs that the president needs to fulfill his or her agenda. So that's the connection. That's why the most successful presidents tend to be the ones who have the highest levels of public support. Because as we talked about last week, a very publicly popular president can use their level of popularity amongst American voters as leverage against Congress. So let's say you have a Congress that is controlled by a majority that doesn't like the president. Maybe the president is from the other major party than the congressional majority, so they hate the president, right? Or maybe Congress has controlled by the same majority as the president's party, but they just don't like the president for other reasons. How can the president force Congress to do what he needs Congress to do? By using his popularity, by threatening their reelection, right? That a president who's not getting sufficient cooperation from Congress can go directly to the American people and say, hey, American people, guess what? I've got a problem. You like me. You know, I'm trying to do a lot of things to improve the situation in the United States. And I've got all these great ideas for rules and regulations and programs and all that sort of thing. But guess what? Your elected representatives, your members of Congress aren't willing to cooperate with me. They're not willing to give me the laws and rules and regulations that I need to help you. So I need your help. I need you to contact your members of Congress, send them an email, post on their social media accounts, do whatever you need to do, and tell them, support the president. Give the president the laws that he wants. And if you don't, maybe I won't vote for you in the next election. And that can be a great way to leverage a lot of presidential support by the public into getting Congress to break down and do what the president wants them to do. So any questions about that? Is that still making sense since we talked about it a week ago? Any questions about the fact that the most successful presidents tend to have the highest levels of public support, and why? Questions or comments? Open up your mic, put something in the group chat. Is this still making sense to us? We're doing okay? Okay. So what I want to do for the rest of our time this morning is to go ahead then and highlight a few, before I do that, I should also ask, are there any questions about anything having to do with the presidency, whether it's information that you picked up from our class notes on the presidency, from our assigned readings on the presidency, from the crash course videos on the presidency, or do you have any questions specifically about the discussion forum post on the presidency that is due tonight at 11:59 p.m. So any leftover questions, comments, problems, etc., relating to the presidency? Anybody? Well, okay. So let us now move on, and let me highlight a couple of important points in the notes for the section that you're going to be working on between now and next Wednesday, because between now and next Wednesday, you're going to be learning a whole lot about the federal court system. That is the judicial branch of the United States. And the main job of the judicial branch, as we are learning, is that its job is to interpret national government laws, to tell us what laws actually mean in practice. So yesterday, I went ahead and opened up the judiciary module for you on our class Canvas page. So you now have access to the class notes on the judiciary. You also have the links for the 3 crash course videos that I want you to take a look at between now and next Wednesday. And if you go to the assignment outline and reading schedule page on our Canvas site, you will also see the assigned reading for our discussion of the judiciary as well. And of course, all that stuff, the notes, the crash course videos, and the assigned reading are all designed to help you do a really good job of responding to your next discussion forum post assignment on the judiciary, which is due a week from tonight. That is Wednesday, May 20th at 11:59 p.m. Again, as always, not counting the grace period, 3-day grace period, right? So if you are able, you might want to go ahead and pull up a copy of the judiciary notes from our Canvas page, from the modules page, and a couple of major points that I want to highlight for you in dealing with the federal court system. Now, the first thing that you will notice when you start scrolling through the notes on the judiciary is that they are a lot less lengthy and a lot less detailed than the notes that I've given you in the previous couple of weeks dealing with Congress and the president. And that is completely intentional. I have a lot less to say about the judicial system simply because the framers also had a lot less to say about the judicial system. The framers created created the federal court system in Article 3 of the Constitution. And if you put Article 1 dealing with Congress next to Article 2 dealing with the president, next to Article 3 dealing with the courts, it's kind of breathtaking just how brief and how vague Article 3 is relative to Article 1 and Article 2. Article 3 is barely there. It is extremely short and extraordinarily vague. The framers had very, very little to say about the federal courts. And if you take a look at point 1 in the judiciary notes, you see why this is. I lay out for you 2 main reasons why the framers didn't see the need at all to put much of any detail in about the court system, how it would be structured, how it would function, that sort of thing. Now, one of the reasons why the framers really didn't sweat the details at all about the courts is because, and I talk about this in point capital A in section 1 of the notes, the framers just felt that the court system of for the federal government would be by far the least powerful and the least dangerous of the 3 national government branches. In other words, the framers believed that there was just about 0 chance of the courts ever becoming too powerful, abusing their authority, threatening democracy, threatening people's natural rights, that sort of thing. So the framers did not fear the courts whatsoever. Okay? And because they didn't fear the courts whatsoever, they saw no need to put a lot of detail into Article 3 about what the courts could and could not do. Now, why is that? Why were the framers so unafraid of the abuse of power potential of the federal courts, of federal judges? Well, if you take a look specifically at point capital A under 1 in the judiciary notes, I lay that out for you. And notice if you look specifically at the words that I have in quotes, and they're also in the bold print to really call your attention to them, the framers had a very specific perspective on the federal courts as they were creating them in Article 3. They believed that the courts were going to be no threat at all in terms of their abusing power. Why? Because the framers believed that the courts had, quote, neither the power of the purse nor the power of the sword, unquote. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, what does that mean? What were the framers thinking about when they said that the courts have neither the power of the purse or the power of the sword? Were they sober? Were they high? What does that weird language really mean? Well, that's the way the framers spoke. That's the way Americans in general spoke in the 18th century. They used very fancy language that they inherited from the British, kind of what we refer to as the King's English. We don't speak the King's English in the US anymore, but they had this very fancy way of saying most things. So let me translate for you. So when the framers say that they don't fear the federal courts abusing power because the courts do not have the power of the purse What they are saying is that the courts do not have control over their own funding. The federal courts do not have control over their annual budget. Okay. Who does? Well, under our separation of powers system, it is Congress who, among other things, determines how much money each national government department and program is going to be allocated for their operations every year. So Congress funds every part of the national government, including the judicial branch. And so the framers said, look, this makes sense. We shouldn't worry about the courts ever becoming too powerful or ever abusing their power, because guess what? If they ever try, if the courts ever start, trying to do too much and abuse power or take away people's freedoms unfairly or threaten the power of Congress or threaten the power of the president, all Congress needs to do to shut the courts down, to stop this from happening, is to just eliminate the budget of the judicial branch, eliminate the budget, take away all the money from the federal courts. They can't operate anymore. They have to shut down. End of problem, end of threat. So does that make sense? Because Congress controlled the court's purse strings, Congress could shut the courts down immediately if the courts ever attempted to abuse their power. And that's one reason why the framers didn't fear the courts. Now, does that make sense so far? Does everybody understand what we say, or what the framers say, when they say that the courts do not have the power of the purse? Any questions or comments about that? Either speak up or put something in the group chat. Does that make sense to us so far? Okay, now there's one other reason why, one other big reason why the framers didn't fear the courts ever becoming too powerful or abusing their authority. It's the second part of that phrase, because the framers knew that the courts, in addition to not having the power of the purse, the courts also do not have what the framers called the power of the sword. And that is the framers' fancy 18th century way of saying a very basic thing. The court system, the federal courts then and now, it's never changed. The courts do not have the ability to enforce their own decisions once they make them. So in other words, when, let's say, the US Supreme Court comes out with a ruling in a particular case, the Supreme Court cannot force the people, the parties in that case, to obey the court's ruling. So the courts cannot enforce their own decisions. They do not have the power of the sword. Why not? Well, again, we have this separation of powers system for the national government that the framers created in the Constitution. And so we know, or we should know, hopefully we know from what we've been learning about the presidency over this past week, that it is the job of the president carrying out his chief executive role. It's the job of the president to enforce all national government laws and all national government court decisions. So the courts make a ruling, but it's up to the president to enforce those rulings, to make sure that people obey any decisions made by the courts. And so this is why the framers didn't fear the courts abusing their power, because they said, look, no problem. If the courts ever start making decisions in an abusive way, if the courts ever start abusing their authority, the president could simply step in and refuse to enforce the court's decisions and say, well, you know what? I don't agree with what the court said. I think the court's abusing their power in this case. So you know what? I'm not enforcing their decisions. I'm not going to force anybody to obey what the court is telling them to do. And that shuts the whole situation down once again. So you start to get a clear idea as to why the framers didn't fear abuse of power by the courts, because the courts didn't have the power of the purse, they didn't have the power of the sword, and the same reality exists today. Even today, Congress still funds the courts, and the president still has to enforce all federal court decisions. Does that all make sense? Questions or comments about any of that stuff? Okay. So the fact that the framers didn't fear the courts, that's one reason why the framers didn't bother putting much detail at all into Article 3 of the Constitution. But guess what? There's one other factor as well. If you take a look at point capital B in your judiciary notes, you see this. The other reason why the framers didn't see the need to put a lot of detail into Article 3 of the Constitution is because the framers kind of assumed that the US federal court system would be structured in pretty much the same way and would function in pretty much the same way as the British court system does. Now, that might sound weird to you at first, because if you think back early in the semester, I emphasized the fact that in creating our current Constitution, the framers tried to make our new system of government as different as possible from the British model, because they feared the British model, right? But here's the exception to that rule. The framers actually had a lot of respect, a lot of trust for the British court system, okay? Why? Because in the years leading up to the American Revolution, while the British king was abusing the American colonists and treating them unfairly, and the British Parliament was also abusing the American colonists and treating them unfairly, the British courts were not. The British courts were the only part of the British government prior to the Revolution that were treating the American colonists equally and fairly, treating American colonists just like any other British citizen living anywhere else around the world. And so because of that, the framers said, well, you know what? There's no point in reinventing the wheel here. Why spend all this time and detail and trouble creating a new court system for the United States when we can just base our system on the British system because it works really well? Why make more work? Why reinvent the wheel if we don't have to? And so that was their other assumption. And that's the other reason why they didn't put a lot of detail into Article 3 of the Constitution. Why reinvent the wheel? But guess what? The fact that the framers didn't choose to put a lot of detail into Article 3 allowed the courts, and specifically allowed the US Supreme Court very early on in its history, to invent a massive power for itself. A power that historians and others even today still debate. Did the framers really intend for the courts to have this power? Because they didn't specifically mention it in Article 3 or anywhere else in the Constitution. And so the other major point that I wanted to highlight from the notes for you today before we wrap things up, if you scroll down in your judiciary notes to point capital E under 1, I talk about this huge, absolutely immense, transformative power that the US Supreme Court invented for itself through the lack of detail in Article 3 in 1803, in a very famous Supreme Court decision in 1803 called Marbury versus Madison. And in the Marbury versus Madison case, the Supreme Court essentially invented this power that we call judicial review. And guess what? This judicial review power is immense, and it has today a huge impact on our lives as folks living in the United States for reasons that you'll understand in a couple of minutes. Now, what is judicial review? Well, if you look at the notes, if you look at point capital E in section 1 of the judiciary notes, you will see that judicial review, that this power has two basic parts. The first part of judicial review says that the courts, the federal courts, and specifically the U.S. Supreme Court, have the sole authority to interpret the U.S. Constitution. So the federal courts, and in the end, the U.S. Supreme Court, they are the last word in deciding what the various words in the U.S. Constitution actually mean in practice, in reality. And remember what we've been saying over the past few weeks, really since the beginning of the semester. A lot of the language in the Constitution is either very complicated or it's very vague. So obviously somebody within the U.S. national government has to have the job, has to have the authority of telling us what the strange language in the Constitution actually means. And so in this Marbury versus Madison case, the Supreme Court said, hey, it's us. The federal courts are the ones that interpret the Constitution, okay? Now that in itself is a huge power, to have the sole authority to tell everybody else in the United States what the Constitution says and means. Because remember, everything that our government does in this country is governed by the Constitution. So the Supreme Court, through judicial review, has the ability to say, hey, here's how the government's supposed to run. Here's what Congress is supposed to do. Here's what the president's supposed to do. Here's what the state governments are supposed to do. That's a huge power. But that's only half the story. Because the second part of judicial review is just as important, if not even more important than the first. Because what it says is that the courts can then strike down, the courts can kill any action by government, any action of Congress, any action of the president, any action of the state governments. The courts can strike down any government action that they believe conflicts with their interpretation of the Constitution. Think about how powerful that makes the courts. Because the courts can first say, okay, here's what this sentence in the Constitution means. And then they can turn around and say, well, guess what? We think that the president just took an action that goes against our interpretation of this sentence in the Constitution. Therefore, we are striking down that presidential action. We are killing it. It is dead. It is gone. That's a massive power. And it's a massive power that the courts invented for themselves because of the lack of detail in Article 3. Because Article 3 doesn't clearly say the courts can do this, but it also doesn't say that they can't. Now, as we'll talk more about next week, next Monday, the biggest impact of judicial review on our daily lives today is this. Because guess what? As we'll talk about next week, we have all kinds of freedoms, right? As folks living in the United States. And next week, we'll talk about the two main types of freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States. We'll talk a little bit about civil liberties, and we'll talk a little bit about civil rights. But how do we know what freedoms we have here in the US? How do we know what our civil liberties and civil rights are? Well, guess what? They're all listed in different parts of the US Constitution. Makes sense, right? So all of our freedoms are listed in one way or another in the US Constitution. Now, because of judicial review, what that means is that in the end, it is the courts, the U.S. Supreme Court specifically, who gets to decide what our basic freedoms consist of. How far do they extend? What do they cover? And under what circumstances can government legally, constitutionally take away or limit some of our freedoms? So we have the freedoms that we have right here, right now in the United States, because the courts have said that we have, based on their use of judicial review, based on their interpretation of the US Constitution. And guess what? As time goes by, as the years and decades pass, the courts will change their mind about our freedoms. The courts will reinterpret different parts of the Constitution. So our freedoms don't stay the same. They're subject to change over time. If the court reinterprets some part of the Constitution, they reinterpret what our freedoms consist of. So it's based on all of that. It's really hard in the year 2020 to say that the courts are the least powerful of the three national government branches. Does that make sense? Any questions or comments about this invented power called judicial review that was created by the U.S. Supreme Court in that Marbury versus Madison case way back in 1803? Questions, comments, anything like that? Okay, so we are out of time for today. So especially, let me just kind of recap some things I mentioned at the very top of the class, since not all of you were logged in when we first started. Remember, your discussion forum post on the presidency is due tonight at 11:59 p.m. plus the 3-day grace period. Your next discussion forum post assignment dealing with civil liberties and civil rights is due, or pardon me, dealing with the judiciary is due next week, next Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. Again, not counting the 3-day grace period. And remember, your Student's Choice project is due 2 weeks from tonight. That is May 27th, Wednesday, May 27th at 11:59 p.m. plus the 3-day grace period. So if you haven't started yet working on your project, get going with it. If it's been a while since you've worked on it, get back to it. And if you have any questions about the Student's Choice project or anything else having to do with the class, you know what to do. Call me. I mean, you can't call me. Sorry about that. You can email me. You can send me a Canvas message, or you can kind of virtually call me, I guess, by participating in my twice weekly virtual student hours on Zoom. Or you can contact me and we can set up a one-on-one Zoom appointment if you can't get to any of those virtual student hours when I have them. So I'm here for you. Reach out to me. Anything having to do with this class or anything else that I can assist you with. Remember, in the end, you are going to be successful in this class, and we are all going to get through this period, this terrible period in our history successfully, because we're working together. Okay? You are not in this alone. So until I see you next time, maybe next Monday or next Wednesday, I should say, for our next Zoom meeting, take care, be safe, be well, and remember, I'm always here for you if you need me. I've got your back. It was great seeing you, or at least great hearing you today. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.